You are tuned into the Power Station Energy 100. This is Let's Talk Business with Mr. Daniel Steinman. We are talking about PSCE, what it is all about, but also how it plays a role in corporate as well as the private sector.
Elsabe, you will recall that just before we went for the break, I said it's an indication of business confidence.
Yeah.
You know, companies will not borrow if they do not have a reasonable view of getting back that money that they invest plus more. The project has to create a surplus.
Yeah.
So for that reason, and to understand where we are now, and to get to the third juicy part of our conversation on what it means and where we're going, we have to look at where we come from. Now, if you look at the 90s, the data on private sector credit was very limited, and I would say in a certain sense obscure, because credit in Namibia is mostly provided by the 4 big banks, and 3 of them were South African controlled. So it means that the reporting need or the legal requirement to report was not here based in Namibia. They had to report to their shareholders. You know, that is so. The data is very erratic, and you can't really depend on it. You have to form a broad picture of what was going on in the 90s, and it was the first decade immediately after independence, and there was a lot of political changes underway. So the economy was important, but the only thing that was important is that the deficit mustn't be too big, because the capital market was not developed. So you only start getting a true picture of private sector credit from 1999 onwards. So into 2000, and it's only after 2003 when we went over to the medium-term expenditure framework in our budgeting process. In other words, where the watchdog is the IMF, that you can really pay attention to the private sector credit data. Before that, it's wishy-washy. The further back you go, up to the point where it's non-existent. But this is very important. More or less from 2003 to 2013, that 10-year period, private sector credit extension was usually in the region of about 11%. This is now the annual figure. Sometimes it hit 13%, and when it was low or slow, it went down to 9%. How this works is that overall credit, this is now private households and companies, commercial part. If you combine the two, this is what you do in private sector credit extension. That's why it's called that. In other words, it's the money that the big companies borrow and the money that you and I borrow. But it's not the government borrowing. The government borrows in the capital market through government bonds. And I think most of our listeners will by now be familiar with that concept, because you and I talk about it a lot. You know, so we came to that point where you can say it was very seldom below 11%, and there's a certain measure of attrition, and this big word only means that if you invest 100 million into a project, you don't get 100 million back. Not immediately. You get back less. The project runs at a loss for a couple of years. You know, so it builds up a deficit. Then it gets to break even. Then it goes into surplus. In other words, it starts creating a profit. This can be after 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years, all depending on the project and on the way that it is structured. But the important thing is that if you have an 11% growth in credit, so credit becomes 11% more every year, then you lose about 3% of this, so that there's 8% left. And if you have inflation of 5%, you take that away and you get to 3%, what we call real growth. And I've also explained that several times, So you need an annual figure above 10% to have a decent growth rate, real growth rate, not nominal, of around 3%, which is what we wanted. We don't really want to go below 3.5%. 3% becomes borderline. So do you see this effect? Private credit extension where we are now is less than half of what it is supposed to be for the economy to growth at a fairly normal growth rate. And that normal, you can see I'm very careful of using that word, but let's say what we used to, or if we put it in a different way, what we need to grow PSCE so that the rest of the economy can grow at an acceptable real growth rate.
And that one, just keep it there. We will continue after this short break.